Our next speaker is going to give a talk today, very much on theme with the last question, so it's a great transition. In his work with college-age students, teaching meditation, Qigong, and contemplative practice to this population in their formative years, I really want to know personally some of his insights in what works and what resonates with this group of people. And I think he's really the perfect person to help develop these young minds. Not only does he have that Daoist practitioner trait where you won't be able to put a number on his age ever, so can always kind of connect with that with younger people, but also because he's done, both sides of the road. He's walked the path that he's taught, and he's also this has this really impressive academic background, of his doctorate and his academic research at Brown University. Excuse me. I'm gonna mute someone really quick. Thank you. And so Larson DiFiori, actually, if I'm honest with myself, really, in my formative years of these arts, actually changed the way that I meditated. I was learning some Neidan fundamentals from Zhou Shifu at Daoist Gate Center. And in the earliest days of learning that, I was kind of like repeating some of the instructions and I was getting somewhere, but something wasn't clicking. And I remember just like in a casual conversation, he told me two things. One about standing meditation. He was like, the first 10 minutes are the worst part. If you can make it through that, like it actually gets, easier, and it motivated me to kind of break through a plateau there. And it was absolutely true. I just needed somebody to have done it before and really embodied it and say, hey, actually, like, it's not like you grind it out like other sports activities, perhaps. It's no, actually, you just relax and you go through it, and somehow things get actually a little easier. So that changed my perspective. And the other one is that he had this completely simple way of talking about seated meditation, giving them the faith to actually like hold through specific barriers and plateaus that if he hadn't shared those very simple experiences with me, I'm not sure I would have persevered in quite the same way. Persevered with a very open mind, which is really the ideal state to experience Taoist meditation. We talked a little bit yesterday when somebody was asking our speaker, Rory Hiltbrand, about do we visualize this, this, and this while we're meditating? And it's, a lot of Taoist meditation is really this process of setting an intention, putting your energy in a specific area with a specific flow, and then just waiting, putting it there, accumulating it, watching what happens. And so his very simple advice and relating of experience was wonderful, and opened up kind of a different world for me. And so at that time, I felt so young with those practices. I might have done them disciplined for years, but not really gotten out the door in the same way, as if he had given me the key to unlock that. So let's hear from a longtime friend of the Daoist Gate Center, superstar academic, teacher at Brown University, doctorate in his research around Taoism and contemplative studies, Larson DiFiori. Why don't you take it away, Larson?
Well, thank you so much, Sam. I think you praise me more than I deserve, I feel sometimes. But I'm so glad that those little conversations were very helpful with you. That's actually, I think, the first time you've told me in so much detail. So that makes me feel very excited. I'm going to be the usual boring academic self, and I'm going to actually share a PowerPoint. So let's see if this actually works on coming up on the stage. And all right, can you see the PowerPoint now? Yes. And if I do this, you can still see it? And if I move slides, it changed slide. Okay. The first year I did this, I gave the talk and it did not change slides, and that was very embarrassing for quite a while. It's still up on YouTube, which is to my perpetual embarrassment. Anyway, so I'm in kind of an unusual position in teaching in that I'm in a religious studies program. That's my official position at Brown University, where I teach. However, I'm part of this special program that's founded at Brown called the Contemplative Studies Initiative. And so for that, we combine the academic teaching of a subject, like talking about Taoist meditation or Buddhist meditation or taijiquan, with an actual practicum where we do it. So here are the famous Brown Van Winkle gates that you're only supposed to go through twice, once when you enter the school and once when you leave Brown. If you know anything about you've probably seen these as a highlight. Um, what is contemplative studies, right? So I figure I'll give you the raw academic definition of it. This is from the fairly new International Society for Contemplative Research that tells us what is contemplative research. So they say, and I quote, "We understand contemplative research to be the scholarly and scientific investigation of meditative and other mind-body practices and their clinical and pedagogical applications. Such research includes the study of traditional and modern techniques that cultivate or focus attention in sustained fashion with the aims of deepening concentration, tranquility, and insight, broadening our understanding of the many forms of consciousness, including non-dual awareness, with all the larger goal of promoting well-being. The spectrum of contemplative research is wide-ranging. It includes work on developing pro-social capacities and dispositions, such as empathy, compassion, and kindness, the study of everyday flow experiences of absorption in an activity, and active approaches to the study of cognition, psychological and philosophical inquiry into the nature of mind and the conditions that foster human flourishing, interdisciplinary inquiry into the social and ethical dimensions of contemplative practices, including their relevance to issues of social justice, conflict resolution, and holistic education, phenomenological depictions of meditative, psychedelic, and otherwise induced states of consciousness, together with scientific investigation of their neurobiological and behavioral correlates, aimed at deriving basic knowledge and evaluating potential clinical applications, and the scholarly study of the most profound and life-changing experiences that people have been deliberately and systematically cultivating in various religious and philosophical traditions." So part of my job as a teacher is also to make things that are somewhat complicated a little more understandable. So I'll try to summarize that. Contemplative studies, to put it in brief, is an emerging interdisciplinary approach to contemplative practices and experiences. What are contemplative practices? Contemplative practices and experiences are basically anytime we have kind of an unusual and really significant kind of moment of focused attention or awareness. So these things happen, as commonly as just say you're hiking out in the wilderness and you see a beautiful landscape, and then suddenly there's some sort of change that happens. You feel different. You feel like this moment is deeply significant and you're profoundly present in that moment. Or it could be sort of flow states, like athletes playing a game or artists deeply involved in their art. Or it can be on the more sophisticated or like disciplined end of the spectrum, the kind of techniques that we see in different religious traditions around the world, including Buddhism and, for our topic today, Daoist practices and those related to Taoism that are designed to foster those kinds of contemplative experiences. So in contemplative studies as a whole, we look at it from multiple angles because no one existing discipline is enough to contain the full study of this subject. So it includes things like scientific and clinical research. So stick an EEG cap or an MRI, stick someone in an MRI while they're meditating and see what's going on in their brain. And also clinical research. So we just last year, some of my colleagues completed a study on showing the positive effects of Qigong on reducing symptoms of fatigue in cancer survivors. So that kind of clinical application. We also look at, and this is where a lot of my work comes in, the cultural and historical context, talking about sort of the history, the philosophy, the theory, the overall system of ideas that surround the practices and that built them up. And then we also look at creative and personal applications. So things like artists who want to take their experience in that contemplative moment into creating artwork. I get a lot of students from Brown University is really close to the Rhode Island School of Design, and I always get a whole bunch of RISD students in my classes every year. And then finally, most importantly, we cultivate actually learning practices themselves, which cultivate what we call critical first-person perspectives. So here, this is the ability to speak with some kind of sophistication about the experiences that we have internally during these states. So when we're doing taijiquan, what are we feeling? What's going on in the body? Some of it like the physical positioning, but also like how are our emotions and our thoughts transforming? How is our attention awareness changing as we're doing the practice? And so this is a kind of sophistication that you need to actually bring to even something like scientific study of this. Because how can you tell if, somebody's got the EEG cap on and they're deep in meditation and they tell you, I'm really concentrated right now. We can see some correlates to that in meditation, but then in the EEG, but something changes. Well, what happened? They need to be able to express what's going on internally. So contemplative studies at Brown, this is from our website. It's a fairly new, again, the whole field of contemplative studies is fairly new. This is actually one of the researchers who was working on the project I just mentioned about Qigong and fatigue, Chloe Zimmerman, who is here putting on an EEG cap. And I'm also part of more very closely relevant to what we're talking about here, this Catherine Kerr Vital Energy and Health and Healing Lecture and Workshop series, which is based on the founder of the lab that did that Qigong research study, Catherine Kerr, who sadly passed away in 2016. Started this interest in the embodied neuroscience lab, which would actually look at, what goes on in Qigong and taijiquan, which are still fairly understudied in the field of contemplative studies. So our lecture series does a lot of online talks like this and some workshops. Actually, Master Joe has given some workshops for us in the past, and some of those lectures are available in recordings online, like for this conference as well. So let me talk a little bit about the history of contemplative studies at Brown. As I say, it's fairly new. It really started even before there was contemplative studies in the early 2000s, when our director, Professor Harold Roth, started teaching Buddhist meditation courses. Actually, I think he started in the 90s, but he formally got grants to do this in the early 2000s. He would teach Buddhist meditation classes that included like a standard course on Buddhism. They would read all the stuff that you would read in a normal university class, but then he added in sessions where the students could actually try out some of the practices. Um, this built up a lot of momentum. At Brown University, you can actually design your own major. So some students already started majoring in sort of proto-contemplative studies at that time. And then in 2014, we declared a formal concentration. That's the name Brown University uses for majors, because that's just a Brown thing to do. It fits really perfectly with what we do. So you concentrate in contemplative studies. So we declared the formal concentration in 2014. We're now celebrating the 10th anniversary this fall. That means that as an undergraduate at Brown University, you can major in contemplative studies, which is pretty cool. This was the first program of its kind anywhere in the world, as far as as I know, and I believe it still is. Maybe there may be one or two others, but I'm not even sure of that. So if you want to do a major in contemplative studies, is a place to go. So in the last 10 years, we've had 69 graduates with majors in concentrations in contemplative studies, roughly half of them focusing on, we have a science track and half on a humanities track. And we've also done a lot of other things, over 240 public events. And our faculty have together taught over 119 courses in the last 9 years, including 44 completely new courses. And a lot of those all the public events, and even a lot of the courses that are funded on a course-by-course basis when taught by our contingent faculty, those are people who are not tenured and are hired on a yearly or course-by-course basis, are supported almost entirely through donations and grants directly to contemplative studies from a few really wonderful donors and from some general public donations as well. So it's also got a research component. I'll mention here we interface with a few other groups that are part of our network with contemplative studies that go beyond just the education component. So there's the Mindfulness Center at Brown University. This used to be up at Worcester at the University of Massachusetts there. This is if you're familiar with mindfulness-based stress reduction, this is the center that was founded originally by John Kabat-Zinn to study that back in the 80s. And it transferred to Brown back in 2018 or 19. And they offer a master's in public health related to that through the Center for Public Health at Brown University. There's also at our medical school, the Warren Alpert Medical School, there's a scholarly concentration in contemplative medicine, which focuses both on bringing contemplative aspects into medical practice. This is for people that are being trained in allopathic Western style medicine, but also on being able to help deal with issues of burnout and other problems that medical students and then later doctors go through with the intensity of their practice. There's also the Embodied Neuroscience Lab, which I've mentioned a few times, and the Clinical and Effective Neuroscience Lab that's headed by Willoughby Britton and Gerald Lindahl. Both of those continuing to produce research. And then also internationally, I mentioned that long quote from the International Society for Contemplative Research. It just celebrated its second annual conference in Padova, Italy, where actually University of Padova now has a master's in contemplative studies that you can study there. And there were over 375 participants there from 38 countries. I went, quite a few other Brown faculty and students went as well. And in fact, the director of the contemplative studies at Brown, Harold Roth, was the conference planning chair for the Padova conference this year, and he's also on the executive committee and is one of the founding members of ISCR. So you can see Brown University is really at the very cutting edge, pioneering forefront of contemplative studies research, and it's my great luck to be here. So, but let me talk a little bit more practically about what I do in the classroom rather than looking at the broader scope of research and how we incorporate the practice and education component. So our courses, sort of our flagship courses, have two major components to it. One is a typical academic course where you have readings and papers and discussions. This is what probably, if many of you think back to if you had courses in undergrad in the humanities in particular, the ones that I teach, you may remember these where you have a bunch of readings. My students grown. I usually give about 100 pages a week. And we have papers every year, and we have discussion groups, and I give lectures. And so these courses provide the context, the rigor, and what we call a critical third-person perspective. And that just is the usual sort of thing you see in an academic or scholarly context, that objective standing outside the subject and looking at it, discussing, say, the historical currents that shaped particular movements, or kind of larger theory about the kind of socio-political elements that are involved in or that are expressed through those different cultural constructions. So those are the kinds of things that we would usually do. And then the second part of the course, and this is the novel part, is we have what's called a meditation lab, which we shorten to call a med lab. Um, and this is a chance to actually try out the practices discussed in the class or ones related to them and experiment in the laboratory of one's own body using critical first-person perspective. So again, if you're sitting in a meditation practice and you're going very deep and you have this profound experience there, being able to, not necessarily in the moment of doing it, because some of that is very difficult to put into words, but how to come back out of it and be able to talk about it in a way that you can relate to others, convey things to others, what's going on, even if you can never actually capture the depths of what's happening there, but to be able to foster a kind of research environment. Or I would say also alternately, figuring out the places you can't talk about. The director likes to talk about also not just first-person perspectives, but zero-person perspectives, where you reach a state of non-duality and you can no longer speak of a self and other, this or that. And then how can you speak of that at all? But having experienced that and know what that feels like. Not many of our students reach that in the course of a single med lab. So, for example, we'd read about a specific meditation practice, right, where it came from, or its history, or the kind of things that surround it, the theory of why it's supposed to work in the seminar context, and then we would try it out in the lab. Now, one thing that's critical about this is that because we're teaching in academic institutions, and this is not a seminary, contemplative studies classes do not enforce or require belief or adherence to the framework among students. So we're not teaching this, we're teaching the students about a particular tradition like Buddhism or Taoism. We're not teaching them to be Buddhists or Taoists. So they don't have to actually adhere to it. We just want them to be familiar with it and be respectful of it as they engage in the practice. So here's an example of a meditation lab. That's Harold Roth directing the lab here. This is he usually does this. I believe this is a Zen sit. He studied for over 40 years with Joshu Sasaki Roshi, who had a Zen center or had a Zen center established. The center's still there in Mount Baldy in Southern California. Unfortunately, Sasaki Roshi passed away at 107 or 108 in Japanese years back in 2013. But Professor Roth has continued on teaching in that kind of spirit, even though he's in continuing this academic context. So you can see there's some aspects of formal practice, the way the cushions are lined up, the types of seating that we're doing, but there's also, this is still within a university setting. This is not monastic, even if there's some flavor of that and the students understand where it's coming from. So let me give you an example from this semester. This is actually just taken from this last week. I'm teaching a course this semester entitled, and this is a mouthful, Self-Transformation and Transcendence in Later Taoist Contemplative Traditions. There's a lot to unpack there. Later Taoist just means that it's from about the 2nd century CE onward. And contemplative, again, we've talked about what contemplative stuff is. And then the self-transformation and transcendence is partially because students really like the idea of thinking about self and transforming it, transcending it. But it also kind of creates this sort of larger context than if I just labeled it Taoist Meditation 101 or whatever, right? So it's basically an introduction to Taoist contemplative practices from the last 2,000 years, and it fits in a sequence with another course that sometimes Professor Roth or I teach, which is on classical Taoist contemplative traditions. And I actually gave a little bit of a discussion of some related to some of those a couple years ago in this Taoist conference series. That's still online. That's the one where we got stuck on one slide for a while. So in the class this week, we have a weekly meeting from 3 to 5:30 on Mondays, and so we'll do a reading. So last week we read the Zhuang Lun, which is attributed to Sima Chengjian. I was a Tang Dynasty, who was the 12th, or depending on how you count it, 13th patriarch of Shangqing. as translated in Livia Cohn's book, Study on It, Sitting on Oblivion, published in 2010. So one of the things is we have to limit the types of things that we read to works that are available in translation, since although there are usually a few students in the class, a couple of them who can read some Chinese, and can even sometimes very competently read classical Chinese, most of the students can't. So we read them in translation. So we read Livia Cohn's book, which has a translation of these texts and then also has her discussion of it. And then we also look at some additional scholarly discourse coming from Stephen Eskildson's book, Taoism, Meditation, the Wonders of Serenity, from the latter Han Dynasty to the Tang Dynasty, which was published through SUNY in 2016. So I give a lecture on that, or I gave a lecture last week, and then we have a discussion at the end of class where we talk about what's going on in those books. Then in the weekly meditation lab on Tuesdays and Thursdays from 10 to 10:50, we actually follow meditation practices that I have learned from my teachers, right, from my practice teachers, that I feel are related to the material that we're doing in course. So this week we were focusing on quiet thought, quieting thoughts, emptying out rational thinking, and returning to an inward focus. So that idea of sitting and forgetting, of, as it says in the Zhuangzi passage, just sloughing off or letting the limbs drop off and dulling the senses and dismissing the usual sense of knowledge in the mind. And merging with the great pervader, right? So that's what the original Zhuangzi passage says on this idea of sitting and forgetting, right? And so these build on and toward additional techniques that I've been teaching in the weeks before this, and I'll continue teaching in the end of the semester as I kind of work from fundamentals of like just basically how to sit for a long period of time comfortably, up to doing increasingly advanced things that will get them to sort of a basic level of meditation practice. So we're not doing, advanced Neidan by the end of the semester, but they have maybe a taster so that if they're interested, they could actually walk into a class like that and have some ability to undertake it and not feel totally lost. So there's a lot of difficulties in teaching a course like this. So one of them is that there's a qualifications issue, right? So for somebody to teach at this level in a contemplative studies classroom in a university, most universities require the academic teachers to have PhDs, so have to get that. And then you also have to get some level of permission and encouragement from your teachers, from the practice teachers, to be able to teach the practice component. Perhaps as a full, ordination and lineage, perhaps just permission for specific practices, more like I have. Um, some classes, the teachers recognize that it's very difficult to have both of these in the same person, so they'll split this role with two teachers in different qualities, with different qualifications. We had one teacher who would do the academic portion of the yoga teaching, and then he collaborated with the yoga teacher who has a studio near the school to offer additional yoga classes to the students. Another thing that we do is this thing called the Virtual Contemplative Mentors in Residence that we started in 2024, which has teachers who are hosted online through the Brown University Contemplative Studies, making available classes for any courses at other universities that want to include a contemplative component, but where the teacher doesn't feel competent offering them. So this semester we're offering, for example, Tai Shamatha meditation, a Qigong class, and we're offering a Korean Zen class that are all available for people that are interested in adding those. So then the role of the teacher too is a little complicated because we have to offer both an academic critique. So we have to be able to step back and, assess how well students are writing a paper or, fostering critical thought, while at the same time offering practice-centered guidance without advocating for a specific religious tradition. So sometimes these are actually in contrast with each other, the types of teaching and information you want to give. When you're giving practice instruction, oftentimes you want to say, um, you know, just do it this way. Don't do it this way to somebody who's starting off. Stand this way, relax your back, bend your knees. And you don't want the students, I mean, you can have a little bit of them say, well, why don't I lock my knees? But you don't want them to say, oh, I feel better locking my knees. I'm going to do it that way. But when you're teaching an academic course, you actually do want the students to come back and say, well, I have a problem with this particular view, right? I think that this maybe doesn't fit with something else I've read here, or this is in contrast to something else. I have a criticism of this, and then you discuss and you get to knowledge that way. So sometimes these two modes of teaching get a little bit in contrast with each other, and it takes a bit of skill to navigate between them, and also to make the students feel comfortable that they can also navigate between them. So the important part is teachers need to understand their own limitations and be able to help students find other teachers that can better help them when necessary. So when the students come to me with questions about practice or something deeper, if I'm teaching like this semester a Taoism course and they want to know something that they really ought to be talking to, somebody who's actually an ordained Taoist about, then part of my role is to be able to recommend them to go and speak to somebody else who's a little bit more qualified than I am in those areas where I know I have limitations, right? So, and then of course, there's difficulties for the experienced students because they have to be able to both do the writing papers part and sit in meditation. Sometimes there's a lot of talk about the how difficult meditation can be sometimes, and people can have sometimes unpleasant experiences meditating. But to be totally honest, I think I've caused far more trauma for my students by asking them to write papers over the years than from asking them to sit and meditate. So, but that has to be both of those components are part of the class. And I have many students who will write to me at the start of the semester and say, "I'd love to take your course, but it looks too difficult. There's too much work." So maybe some other time. Um, anyway, but there's other sort of deeper effects, and this is something I keep um, thinking about a lot as a teacher. And I actually part of my paper at the International Society for Contemplative Research conference in Padova this summer was talking a little bit about this topic. Is that a lot of these contemplative practices are deeply, deeply transformational. So these are some paraphrases from some of my students who were taking my classes. So one of them said, and again, I'm paraphrasing, this is not exact quote, but I'm worried that practicing will change my perspectives and values so that I will no longer be able to pursue the career and goal-oriented major I came here for. Um, or another student said to me after majoring in contemplative studies and just a few weeks before graduating, he told me that contemplative studies changed me. I can no longer pursue the career goals in finance that I came to college for. Now, although this is on some levels a deeply existential crisis, speaking with both of the students since then, and also with their families, particularly in the case of the second student whose parents I met at graduation, both students felt that the change in them was more fulfilling than their original paths, and their families agreed with them and said it was a major change, or the second student. But the concern still remains that we're doing something that's a little bit different. And so these are some of the difficulties that the students encounter, right? So there's a tension between the types of values that we're presenting through the contemplative practices and other modes of learning in the university. So especially at a school like Brown University, that is a very competitive school to enter into, has very, very small admissions rates. These students are used to a competitive and achievement-based lifestyle where their whole lives up to this point, it's pretty much been structured on figuring out how to put together their college application together. And then when they get to college, it's about how to get all the grades and how to get all the clubs so that they can then get their resume together so they can get the good job. And more increasingly, students are turning towards majors that are more likely to give them what they see as a better career in the future. So there's this very heavy careerism, career orientation that's going on at all universities at this time. It's not just at Brown University. And yet, here in these classrooms, we're presenting them with things that are slower and really life-nourishing practices, right? How, if we reduce our desires, for example, this was part of the conversation last week, if we're cutting back on the things we want, if we really want to achieve those things, how can we achieve those career goals? The students are taught to stay hungry all the time, to really want something. You need to want it to be able to get it. Fake it till you make it, right? You need to push to try to do this. And here we're telling them, just sit there and just be what you really are. That's kind of tough. So then also we're looking at this other kind of language-based discursive knowledge, which is what you got in the university. And what I'm kind of doing right now is just telling you about things. And you're thinking on a very probably, maybe not, but on a very linguistic level about this, or in classrooms reading and discussing and talking about it, versus this kind of experiential skill-based knowledge of getting a knack for something. The more you practice something, the more you get that knack. You don't have to think every time, oh, I need to bend my knees at such and such an angle so that I can get right into my standing meditation posture. At a certain point, you just do it. You just know it's right because you've practiced it enough. You've got the knack for it. So you can't just read a book on meditation or taijiquan or qigong and then just immediately practice it and understand it. Some students think they understand it from then, and that's always kind of a fun experience to kind of go through that and to see some of this frustration that's building in certain students who are used to just being able to read it and get it right away. Again, these are often very, very intelligent people who are coming to these classes. To then have to realize that no, I need to sit here and I need to wrestle with this week after week, even though it seems like it's all mind if I'm sitting and meditating. It's really this sort of skill thing that they're developing. And so then the another part is short-term and class-centered learning. It's usually like you take this semester, then you get credit for it, right? And then you move on to the next credit. You take this number of credits, you get this major. You attend college for this number of years, then you get your degree, and then you're kind of done, is the way this is often presented. And then you move on to the next stage. But all of these things, these contemplative practices, are lifelong learning. You never stop doing them. You just keep going and going and going. So our class only meets a couple times a week for a few months, but to really get the depths of these practices, they need to really keep doing it for much longer than that. So for example, when I teach the taijiquan course, I have a course where we look at like history and theory of taijiquan, and we do taijiquan as part of the course. I only have 12 weeks to teach them. So that's enough to get a basic form on a very basic level. But if they don't keep it up and they don't find other teachers or they don't find other places to practice, they don't practice as a group, then that's quickly lost. So that's also kind of a bit of a contrast, and that goes faster than the, memorizing what was read in a book, right? And then this final part, and this goes back to those previous quotations, what is important for a meaningful life, right? Students end up reframing their perspective on what they value and what they're seeking for through taking these classes. And oftentimes it's a very profound and meaningful change for them. There's also pressures on the teacher. So I've talked a bit about these, the rigorous and careful transmission of both fields. I need to maintain that objectivity and ability to critique and understand a wider context. So if I'm teaching the Laozi, the Tao Te Ching, for example, I need to be able to say that both that the tradition that has been in place for over 2,000 years has this idea that there was this teacher, Laozi, Lao Dan, who wrote this text and transmitted it down for future generations. And that Laozi actually is even a manifestation of the cosmic Tao and also can be revered as a divinity. And so there's this singular person speaking with this voice. And yet there's also a scholarly critique that now suggests very strongly and is mostly accepted now, especially in Western academia, that the Lao Tzu is actually a multivocal text that was drawn from an oral tradition and put together over a period of time without a single author. How do you frame both of those things together, right? I have to present both of those in that critique. And well, staying true to the roots of my training as a scholar and really make sure the students get that authentic understanding. I need to be able to articulate what's going on in something that's fundamentally ineffable, that is very difficult to or impossible to put into language, but I have to present it in language because a major function of the transmission is through lecturing and teaching and talking. And then I also have to let the students have an ability to properly assess, different and sort of conflicting ideas. So there are contradictions in the texts, right? Most of the old Daoist texts at some point, or a lot of them, they'll go through and they'll say, oh, don't follow any of these practices or these methods. They're all wrong, right? And so if we're reading texts that are coming from two different branches, that some embrace some things and some embrace other things, how do they deal with that? They're also learning things in other classes that are telling them this is the way to live, and then they're looking at stuff that these texts sometimes very forcefully assert this is the way to live. How do you deal with that contrast? So I have to be able to help them navigate and work through that. And just as the practice demands the patience on my own part, I also have to be patient and sensitive to the needs of my students, right? I can't just make something up, right? Unless I've tried some of that myself or I've been through it. I can't just say, oh yeah, do this because I read it in a book. I have to have actually tried it out and have some sort of deep experience with it and tested it myself. And then the students also respond really differently to the same practice. So one of the ways I assess student practice is I have them all write regular journals. So they have to write 3 entries a week that they'll turn into me at regular intervals that talk about what happened during their practice, what they're encountering. Most of the time it's things like, oh, my leg started falling asleep halfway through, or, I was really worried about a test, so I got preoccupied with that and I couldn't focus, right? But sometimes it gets a little bit deeper and you have these kind of interesting experiences that go on with the practice that require a certain amount of sensitivity to it. And I'll tell you, for pretty much every type of exercise I introduce or practice I introduce in the class, there's at least one person who absolutely loves it and says, this changed my whole life. This is the most amazing thing ever. And then there's somebody else who writes and says, I didn't like this very much. It was terrible. It made me feel really uncomfortable. I don't think I want to do that again. And also, everybody, just because something worked for me doesn't mean it's going to work for particular people in the group, or a certain explanation works for me, doesn't work for them. So I need to really think and I need to watch a lot how people are responding to things and think about how to adjust the way I'm teaching, right? And I also have to understand that I can't just, even though I want to present so much, right, every single time, here's everything that's going on. I can't just give it to them. Sometimes they need to sit there and get a little bit today, and then next time they get a little bit more, and then next time they get a little bit more, and watch as things kind of unfold. So I have to be very patient as a teacher too. Now, there are potentially really positive outcomes to this teaching format, which is that students gain this deeper understanding of the course material by having this experiential component, right? So when we're reading a text that talks about this kind of the importance of silence, or that's talking about interesting phenomenon that happen, like sort of chi sensations that happen in the body, that comes up in some of the courses, or even just sort of a sense of kindness and compassion that can develop out of silence, joy that can develop, unconditioned joy that can come out of just sitting perfectly still, right? That stuff sounds really abstract and kind of strange if you don't have any direct experience of it. But then by having a chance to sit down and wrestle with that, sometimes the students get a deeper understanding of it. They get a deeper understanding of also things like the way that consciousness in the mind works. A lot of people, and maybe many of you have had similar experiences to this, but are used to think that when starting out, uh, it's like, oh, I can just sit here and do nothing for 5 minutes, but then you ask them to actually do nothing, and the mind starts running here and there. And all that discipline that we feel we've had, especially for somebody who's, in a university setting like this, who's been studying really hard, working really hard, you think you can discipline your mind really well, and then you sit down, and you're like, what am I going to have for lunch? Oh, wait a minute, I was supposed to be focusing on this. And so just having that experience, and it can be frustrating. It can be really frustrating, right? Um, but then beyond just having that experiential component, these techniques are also really helpful to the students on a personal level. And this is something that many, many of them have reported to me, whether they've ended up majoring in contemplative studies or not. There's so much pressure to perform in these competitive academic and career environments that most of them are just really stressed out. There's a lot of studies that have been showing that levels of anxiety and depression among college populations have been skyrocketing, especially since the pandemic. I think they're up to almost a quarter of all college students now are reporting severe instances of this and are going in for counseling. And a lot of that, is using psychiatric interventions or, of course, different types of therapy. But there's a hope that also, learning something that's a little bit calming and stabilizing can also help a large number of students. And in fact, during the pandemic itself, when we were all online, that was when I had the largest increase in students. Actually, all of the contemplative studies courses across the board had a huge influx. I think I had something like 55 or 58 students for my Qigong class that year, and who were all really, really desperate for some way to feel. They were all stuck at home or in dorm rooms, watching online through these virtual classes, and they really wanted something that could help them feel a little bit more stable and safe in a very disturbed world at that time. Um, and then I think the last part of this that's a positive outcome, and this is in some ways what oftentimes I feel the most proud of, is I'm one of the primary advisors for undergraduates thinking about majoring in contemplative studies. Most of them come and they'll talk with me about what courses to take and what their goals are and whether it's right for them or not, or how to, navigate through different sorts of issues that come up. So one thing that's really interesting is most of our contemplative studies majors go on to careers that involve some kind of service. So this is ones that you think of right away. Like a lot of them go into education, all levels of education, from kindergarten all the way through college. A lot of medicine, many different types of medicine. There's a lot of nonprofits. So many of them will both startups or will join existing nonprofits or go into civil service type stuff. A lot of them do clinical research. In fact, at the ISCR, we actually had several of our former graduates who were coming in and giving papers on their clinical research in neuroscience or psychiatry, and how that interfaces with different types of meditation, contemplative practice. Different types of arts. We've had musicians, we've had visual artists, we've had potters, all kinds of people who, again, bring that into the art that they're creating that can bring a lot of joy and insight into other people as they share their art as well. But it's also true for, we've had students who go into what I think, people going into college these days think of as more safe careers. Well, I guess medicine's considered a safe career, but also things like law, finance, and venture capital. I had a conversation this summer with one of our recent graduates who just got into a venture capital firm that supports startups, and he attributed their interest in him primarily to his majoring in contemplative studies and his ability to talk about sort of the awareness and consciousness and the being able to narrate first person experiences and how that relates to things like development of AI and artificial intelligence. And that was really interesting to the startup. And so they hired him on. He was very excited about that. So it can be really surprising the avenues that people take with this contemplative studies background, especially because we incorporate so many different fields that come into it. But again, I think the thing that's so heartening to me is at least all the ones I've talked with afterward and followed up with seem to have this real desire to want to help others and bring some good into the world in whatever way and capacity they can. And a lot of that is coming from this deep-seated level of introspection that they've gained through the practice and through the discussions we've had on contemplative stuff. So I'm going to turn now to give us a little bit of an example practice. So I'm actually going to, I don't think any of my students, I don't see any of my students here in the workshop, so I can give a sneak preview of what we're going to be doing next week. So we're working right now. We've been doing stages where we've learned to sit properly and start relaxing the body and kind of work with the breathing to kind of create a more patterned and stable experience. And now what we're starting to do and clearing out the mind and being able to quiet the thinking. And so now what we're trying to work on is getting into the interior of the body, since so many Taoist practices involve being able to visualize interior spaces or being able to not even just visualize, but just experience and be present in them. For example, this week we're going to be reading about the Qihai, which is located in the lower abdomen. And here it's worth distinguishing this does not necessarily mean the CV6, the acupuncture point. In some of these older texts, it also refers to, is used somewhat synonymously with the Dantian region, sometimes a little differently, but it's sort of a similar area. So this ocean of Qi area. And part of this is one of the examples is in one of the readings this week. We're reading the Cunshen Lian Qi Ming, which is attributed to Sun Tzu Miao. Again, this is Livia Cohn's translation. Focus your mind peacefully on the ocean of Qi. Visualize spirit in the elixir field. That's the Dantian. Control the mind and quiet your thinking. Once the ocean of Qi is replenished, you will always feel satiated naturally. So, in an abstract, that sounds really cool. There's this ocean of chi, this sort of battery of chi that's in the body where it settles and it stores. And if you build up that chi, okay, then you feel like you have more energy. Theoretically speaking, okay, great, you can understand it on that level. But then you ask, like, well, where is it, right? And if you give just a description of, well, it's usually depicted as being in the lower abdomen. The dantian, for example, is described as being about 3 cun, so about a hand's width below the navel. Although there's debates in the text whether that's if you're sitting up, if it's vertically, or if it's lying on your back, if it's then directly underneath the navel, or if it's somewhere in between. The old texts are great. You try to read through them and figure out what they're talking about. But just thinking that, right, the students oftentimes have a difficulty conceptualizing of that. Remember, most of them are coming in from a background where they're not used to thinking about like a subtle energetic space, or if they do, they think it's kind of weird, mystical stuff, or they associate it with like TV shows or cartoons or whatever that they've grown up with that are, some sort of almost magic, right? And so this idea of being able to find that space in the body is quite difficult. Um, Even if I talk about things like breathing, right? Breathe to your abdomen. There will always be somebody that'll say, but the breath doesn't go to the abdomen. You only breathe into your lungs. That's as far as the air goes. So how do you describe that feeling of the breath going all the way into the abdomen in a way that doesn't sound mystical and strange to them, but is actually something they can get a hold of and then they can start working with, right? And then the other tendency is if you just say, oh, it's in the abdominal area, and a lot of people do this. I did this for a very long time. There's a tendency to still say kind of on the outside of the body, on the surface, or just a little bit under it. And to get really into the center is very, very hard. Because it's easier to pay attention to something you can feel or that has some sort of tangible presence than something that's not present. So like if I were to say, pay attention to the empty center of the room, right? That's really hard. That's really different than saying, pay attention to the table that's in front of you, the screen that's in front of you. Okay, that's something tangible you can focus on. So it's kind of like that in the body. So how do we get there? And then the other thing that's part of this is there are many ways that you can get into this space. But most of the students, if they have a practice background, which is increasingly more students have done some form of meditation or yoga or some kind of breath-based therapy, most of it has to do with breathing and breath. So in fact, even the other contemplative mentors sessions that we have primarily work with breath. Most of the other classes that have med labs primarily work with breath. And so students tend to have this sense that the contemplation, in fact, equals a focus on the breath, and that breath meditation is really the only kind of meditation. It's a very good meditation. It's a very powerful meditation. But for people that have experience with different types of practices coming out of related Daoist tradition and some other traditions too, you know that there's other ways where you don't have to just use the breath as a focus. But I tend to start there and use the breath to kind of guide them to other focuses just because sometimes it's hard for them. If I don't do that, when I was first teaching it, people would always say, "What about the breath?" So now I start with the breath, right, and work with that so they always have a little bit of it. So I'll give you an example of a basic exercise that uses following the breath and basic physiology to get into that interior space. So instead of working with like subtle networks of qi, we're going to get into that space without really talking about qi at all, unless you want to understand breath as qi. So to begin with, if you want to follow along and practice, the important thing is just to sit upright with the back away from, if you're sitting in a chair, not resting against the back of the chair, but the back upright, and to try to get the spine aligned more or less. If you are sitting on the floor, you're also welcome to do that. I'm not going to go too into detail on the best way of getting a posture, just to get the spine nicely upright. And for your hands, you can rest them for the purpose of this exercise however you like. If you have a preferred hand position, you're welcome to do that, a mudra or a hand seal. Or if you want, you can just rest them on your knees, whatever feels comfortable for you, or fold them in your lap, whatever feels most comfortable for you. The eyes, I recommend just leave them just slightly open to avoid too much sleepiness. If you really can't, it's okay to close them, but if you fall asleep, don't blame me, okay? And we'll go back to looking at the spine very briefly. So the main part of aligning the spine is feeling the top of the head reaching upward. If you like, you can think of a string pulling from the crown of the head up towards the sky. Or if you prefer, almost like your head is being floating in water and just kind of gently floating upward. And then the lower part of the spine is stretching downward, like the tailbone at the base of the spine is connecting down into your seat. And as you feel these two poles, the rising and the sinking, you'll notice that the spine gently begins to elongate. So note we're not trying to force the spine to be straight. Sometimes that makes it a little bit too stiff. But we're trying to allow the spine to elongate. And as we're doing that, we're relaxing the muscles all up and down along the spine. Usually good starting from the top of the head and moving along the back of the neck and between the shoulder blades, down the middle of the back, all the way to the base of the spine, relaxing. And as you do that, you might actually feel you're getting a little bit taller as the spine comes into alignment and all that tension that's squeezing the vertebrae together releases. So we're getting a little bit more space. And we're also allowing the shoulders to relax, neither arching them too far forward or backward. And so that opens up the chest area, opens up the whole torso. And then we're relaxing the front of the body as well. So again, starting from the top of the head, relaxing down the forehead and the face, relaxing the neck and the chest, relaxing around the solar plexus and the ribs, and relaxing the abdominal muscles. Allowing the abdominal muscles to move as we breathe, letting go of any residual tension. If you like, you can continue this exercise of relaxation starting from the top of the head and almost washing down from the crown of the head all the way down to the soles of the feet. Like you're standing in the shower at just the right temperature, just whatever would feel good right now. Or if you prefer another metaphor, maybe you're standing in the sun, the sunlight is washing over you at just the right temperature. And progressing down from the top of the head down to the feet in waves at your own pace. Washing away tension, stress, sinking down, letting go of anything you feel you need to let go of, washing it down into the drain, into the ground. And so here we're relaxing and aligning the body. And especially feel yourself sinking down into your seat, almost melting down, rooting, anchored, grounded. stable. Now let's take a moment and narrow our focus. And we'll bring it down to the tip of the nose. See if you can find your breathing. Just take a moment to notice the quality of the breath. How soft is the breath? Some of the old Daoist texts say that eventually the breath can become so soft it won't move a feather placed under the nose. We probably won't get there today, but let's give the breath permission to become a little bit softer. How smooth is the breath as it comes and goes? Is it flowing smoothly, without obstruction, without peaks and valleys, without breaks? Just let it become a little bit smoother, giving it permission to let go of anything that might be causing roughness, and returning to a nice smooth path in and out. How even and continuous is the breath? As it comes and goes, is the inhale longer or the exhale longer? For our purposes today, see if you can allow the inhale and the exhale to become balanced and more even. Noting the transitions between them, allowing that transition to become smooth and continuous. Even if it seems to pause, it's like the pausing of a ball thrown up in the air as it hangs there for a second as its velocity changes before beginning its downward descent. Already in the inhale is the exhale, already in the exhale is the inhale. Notice the length of the breath. Give the breath permission to become just a little bit longer, letting it fall into a nice, relaxed, long pattern, becoming steady without straining, without forcing. And now we're going to use the depth of the breath. So begin following the breath up through the nose, back of the mouth, as it comes and goes at its own pace, along the back of the throat, to the center of the chest. Feel it branching into the two lungs in the center of the chest, expanding and contracting. And just bring a measure of kindness to the lungs, a little bit of gratitude to them for breathing all day, every day. Below the lungs, see if you can find the diaphragm muscle. When we inhale, it sinks down. When we exhale, it rises up. See if you can feel that muscular movement that is part of the breath. And as it presses down, feel the pressure traveling from the chest down into the abdomen. And as you relax the abdominal muscles, allow the belly to expand, feeling how that pressure sinks down deeper and deeper into the abdomen. Follow that path down, that pressure. And just notice this interior space. Notice as it expands and contracts, as it sinks and rises. And gradually settle into this space. Allow the sense of the exterior of the body to sink into the background. Allow the feeling of the breath to move to the background as well. And just for a few moments, just dwell, just live in this interior space. No purpose, no intention, other than simply being. And now slowly start coming back, finding the thread of the breath as it comes and goes, feeling how it moves the whole body, rising and sinking, expanding and contracting, finding the exterior of the body again, relaxing whole body, feeling your weight sinking down into your seat, grounded downward. Noticing the sensations on the skin, the feeling of the air in your clothes. Slowly listening out with your ears to hear the sounds of the room around you. And whenever you're ready, your own pace, gradually opening your eyes wider and wider to let the light in and extending your vision back out. Okay, well, that's the basic way that I do the practice so that we can get into that Dantian Qihai interior space. We're not exactly at the Dantian here, but we're close to it, or closer, without actually having to maybe challenge students' categories yet about what constitutes the body. It gives them a chance to ease their way into it. So that's what I have for my talk. I'm sorry I went a little bit over, but I'm happy to field some questions now, if there are any questions.
Yeah, thank you, Larson. Certainly, thank you for your time. Let's we have some really positive comments in the chat box here, but I'll start with some questions. It's really interesting. This is for my own reflection too. Uh, you mentioned something that I think we deal a lot with in Chinese medicine school as well, which is that we have these kind of like higher achieving students that are taught very strictly like there's a right and there's a wrong. And then they get to a place like these practices are very similar to Chinese medicine in that they can hold contradiction, or we can use multiple lenses at the very same time. We can say the breath goes into the lungs and also have a imagery or feeling that the breath is going into the dantian at the same time. Like you don't need to choose one or the other. Whereas I think that may be a shortcoming of modern Western education is that it really does it really does teach people and condition people to say there's only one answer that you can choose. This is the answer. All the others are not the answer. When in reality is a little bit less like that. Uh, Even the careers that they go into often are less like that if they go into business or they go into health or they go into something like that. Um, but that's just a little aside. And let's go to the first question here. Some wonderful uh, reflections here by Dia. And her question is, are you teaching the way, like the ancient traditional way of teaching? Um, did the original masters, did they allow their beloved students to be savvy? Yeah, I think, if I'm interpreting the question correctly, are we teaching the traditional way? Or are you kind of taking anything out and making it less holistic to be digestible for the academics?
Well, this is one of the huge debates actually in the transmission of these techniques into modern culture. So there's some techniques like mindfulness-based stress reduction that do what we call deracinating, which is pulling out the roots. And they will try to take away mindfulness-based stress reduction is based primarily on some Buddhist techniques. And although they will acknowledge the roots of Buddhism, there's an idea that you don't want to put too much of that in the teaching because it will scare off a lot of people who might be helped by it. And the founder of it, John Kabat-Zinn, actually nowadays really espouses the Buddhism and sees it as this kind of expedient means, if you're familiar with Buddhist practices of transmitting it. So there's a bit of complexity there. But there is a concern on the one hand about, the science becoming too dominant and then also deracinating or even appropriating. So there's a cultural appropriation component to this as well of, are we just going in and stealing these techniques and then presenting them in a way without, actually appropriately recognizing the people and the places they've come from. This is really important to me in my teaching and with my colleagues in contemplative studies because we really try to give the foundational understanding of the original context. So students really learn, like, who were the people who were creating these techniques? Who are the people who treasured them? How did they teach them, right? Why was it important to them, right? And so then coming to respect what those traditions are as much as we can, right? There's always a bit of a barrier there. And then in my teaching, I try to follow a line as close as I can to teaching something that's as close to the traditional practices in the ways that I've been taught, but that also acknowledges the kinds of places the students are coming from. So, for example, a traditional way of doing this would be just as a teacher, I'd say, just do this practice. Here, just focus on this area. And then you wait until you get there and you get that feeling. And then the student comes back and then says, oh, I had this experience. And then the teacher can provide more information, right? But I've found that for a lot of these students, they're not used to being patient in that way. They can be very patient when they're focusing on something that, is in front of them, but to focus on just be aware of the interior space, that's hard, right? It's not the sort of thing they're used to. So giving them something to hold on to and then also putting it in language that because we're going at a deeper level here, we're also getting at the way that we have sort of knee-jerk reactions to things. And because so much of the life of most of the students I have is shaped by this sort of modern scientific materialism perspective, I have to address that when I'm presenting it to them. So it's kind of walking a fine line to that, respecting the ancient teachings. And it's also hard to say, how did people 2,000 years ago teach things? I mean, I can look at what it says in the text and try to replicate it, but it's a little difficult to do that. So trying to walk that fine line and then hopefully convey these in a way that is respectful of the source, but also can open doors for the students in a way that can really help them and help others. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it sounds like you're kind of speaking two languages at the same time.
Yeah, it drives me a little nuts sometimes.
Yeah, I'm sure. I'm sure. One question that came in a private message is, what are some of the most common critiques or things that are difficult for your students to swallow, specifically about the practice you're teaching of Qigong and meditation?
I think the most difficult one that I've seen again and again is the idea of letting go of wants and desires.
Mm,
Because they are so programmed to the only way you get something is you have to want it, you have to pursue it, you have to be productive all the time. This is what they're told over and over again. And this is especially in a context of this particular type of university setting. They're so driven by that they'll sit down for a minute and they'll say, oh, I'm not being productive. Or when we talk about the idea of reducing your desires and then might be more content, they have this sense that that's almost like giving up, right? Being content, being satisfied with something is, surrendering in some way or not being strong enough. And so to work with that and say that there is a kind of courage in actually saying, I have enough, right? I don't need to go out and get all these things. I can be satisfied with what I have. It doesn't mean you're starving to death. A lot of these texts, the Zhuanglun itself also really kind of clearly says you need to eat. You can't just like not eat anything. I mean, maybe if you become a really high level practitioner, right? They offer, but at least you're starting out the practice. You need to have a roof over your head. You need to have food, right? Maybe you have people who depend on you. You need to take care of those things. But it's getting rid of that kind of craving and that pursuing and that wanting and that desire for competition and conflict. And it's so programmed in most of them that they have to wrestle with that. And it's such a relief when they can let go. Um, yeah, I think that's the most common thing I hear, other than
yeah.
pain in my legs from sitting too long.
That does show up. Yep. Yeah. No, that's really interesting. It reminds me of some of the passages, in the classics, even the Tao Te Ching, where they talk about, um, like not being afraid to look like a fool, not being afraid to go against societal norms in that way. Is that the wise person often looks like an idiot. And I think they're very much in that cultural mindset of we only go this direction, everything else is left, right, or back is the opposite of that. So it can't be right. And it's cool that you have people that are in some of these other professions too, because it shows how multidimensional these practices can be and how much they can help people, even if people are in, I have students in finance. I have students that are, their job is to do business things and to make a decent amount of money. And yeah, there's even within that community, there's like a starving for it. Maybe it starts out small when you're in college and you think that these things will make you happy, and then you realize there's only so many Ashton Martins that that you can buy before you start to realize maybe that's not the way to fill yourself up.
Yeah, it's true. At a certain point, you can't take all that with you, right?
Yeah, right. Um, yeah, so I have this comment here. Does the Contemplative Studies at Brown University offer classes on mysticism and the various contemplative traditions in the West that also explore the non-dualistic realm?
Yes, but not as much as we would like because we're always looking for more teachers to do that. So we do have courses on Jewish mysticism. I don't think those have a lab component, or at least not a formal lab component. And we've had people do courses on Sufi mysticism and Christian mysticism at different times. Again, maybe not necessarily with lab components to them, but we're always looking to incorporate more of that. I had a student, for example, that really, really wanted to study Western alchemy. And she is Italian, and she wanted to do a project going up and interviewing modern day Western alchemists in Sicily. And I thought this was the coolest thing ever, but unfortunately, it didn't quite work out to be able to get the funding for that. We had trouble getting her advisors for the project. So she did something else. But maybe I'm hoping we'll do that in the future. So yeah, we're looking for more of that. The field is predominantly, mostly oriented around Buddhist practices. So even just talking about Taoist practices is kind of unusual for the contemplative studies field. But we are open and we're trying to expand to more stuff. The panel I was on at Padova actually had a Jesuit priest who is there talking about different practices that are done in the Jesuit order that can be considered contemplative. So yeah, we do include some of that in the overall scope. Not in my classes, I'm not qualified for that, but in the overall scope of contemplative studies, yes.
Very cool. Yeah, thank you for that. Um, I think I'll wait like 30 more seconds to see if any more questions roll in. But thank you, Larson, for being here. This is a really enlightening talk, and I think it's really cool to see this particular population at work. I remember I can relate to this population because your students are coming into meditation, being like, I'm, so mentally sharp, I'm so mentally smart that we're going to, tackle this problem with the same tool set that that they're used to tackling things with, and being greeted perhaps with some humbling experiences when they first try to do that, because it doesn't work the same way. Yeah. Yeah, as another commenter said, it would be interesting to explore the differences between an environment like Wudang and the Ivy League mentality. I'm
Yeah.
sure that you have a unique way of seeing that.
Oh yeah, it's very different. Well, I have, so I've studied with Master Joe over the last however many years, including doing intensives up at the retreat center at Shenzhou in New Hampshire. And right when but then and before that, when I was an undergrad, I actually did study at one of the schools on Wudang for a month or so, and when I was living in China. And it really is different because when you're doing an intensive like that, you get up, you do your Qigong, you eat, you go do your first round of training, you eat again, maybe you sleep because you're so tired until you get used to it, and then you have a little more energy. Then you go and you do another round, and then you maybe sleep again if you're just getting used to it. Then you eat, and then you go to bed, and then the next day you do the same thing over again. And a lot of times you get this feeling like, I've done this move like 200 times already today. Surely I've got it. But the teacher comes over and says, no, no, it's still not right. You forgot it again. Do it again. Like, fix this. Your hand isn't quite right. You don't have, and then sometimes it's even harder. It's like, you don't have the right feeling. What do you mean the right feeling? But you get that sense. And it's the sort of thing you build up over time, and eventually you get a sense of where you're at, right? But it's so different than, like, the Ivy League, let's take a test and then I'm going to get a score and then my grade is going to show up, and also the other thing is really when you're practicing martial arts, at least these days. I know in the past, like if you actually needed to fight somebody, that was something different, right? And I also know there's a lot of young people in China today who are going to martial arts schools who are specifically going for competitions, and that is their whole life, and there's a very competitive experience there. But at least the luxury I've had when I've been able to go to these centers, and the people that that I've been interacting with, a lot of the people, is that we're going to find, health and well-being and some sense of fulfillment and deeper understanding. And so that's a goal that you're not going to be able to reach in a week or a month or a year, right? It's something that you just have to keep working at, and you just have to when the teacher comes over and criticizes you, you can't just, say you get this little moment where you're like, oh, you can't criticize me, which, in the academic classroom you could say, yeah, I'm right, you're wrong, and then do that. But you don't do that when you're training. You say, you know what, the teacher saw something. How do I incorporate that? And you accept that, and that's part of the training too. So it is a very different situation. Yeah.
Yeah, especially within Chinese martial arts or even meditative culture, there's an aspect of like, oh, thank you for criticizing me because it means you're paying attention. The worst criticism you can get is to never hear anything from your teacher and to have them give up on you because you're so hopeless over here. Yeah,
Great.
cool.
Well,
Well,
thank you again, Sam. Thank you, Master Joe, for again, both of you organizing this year and offering this. This is wonderful. And it's always a pleasure to be here. I'll look forward
awesome.
to it.
Yeah, thank you, Larson. And once again, somebody asked if they'll be recorded. Yes, we're recording. It'll be on YouTube after the talk. And yeah, I hope people are really enjoying and learning these first two from these first two presentations. So the next one, I'm actually going to hit quickly, stop and then a go on the record.